welcome everybody to this evening's event. So welcome to the UW Common Book event, Field Notes from a Catastrophe Live with Elizabeth Kolbert. My name is Youren Bauman. I'm an environmental economist. I will be your MC for the evening. I have 3 qualifications for that role. First of all, I teach environmental studies and environmental economics in the program on the environment, the UW Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies program. Secondly, I do research on the economic impacts of climate change in the Pacific Northwest. And third, I do stand-up comedy. I'm not gonna tell you a joke. I'm not gonna do any comedy tonight. You'll have to go to my website, standupeconomist.com. I want to address a popular misconception about comedy that gets at the heart of what I found impressive about the Common Book. People think that the hard part of doing stand-up comedy is making people laugh, and that's really not true. The hard part of doing stand-up comedy is making enough of a connection with your audience that they give you a chance, that they open up to what you have to say, that they engage with you. And that's the case with climate change education also. Making a connection with the audience, getting them to give you a chance. Elizabeth Kolbert's success at making that connection is one reason that her book, Field Notes from a Catastrophe, was chosen as the 2007-2008 UW Common Book. We're so lucky to have Ms. Kolbert here with us to take part in a panel discussion, and we are delighted to also have UW professor and climate scientist David Battisti and King County Executive Ron Sims to provide their perspectives on this issue. I will introduce our esteemed panelists in a few moments, and shortly thereafter they will start taking questions from students, from all of you. First, however, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ed Taylor, Dean and Vice Provost of Undergraduate Academic Affairs.
Thank you, Youren. This is our second year doing a common book, coming together. Last year, the book we chose was Mountain Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. We brought Paul Farmer here and we brought Tracy Kidder here, and we had a wonderful conversation. This year, we indeed chose Elizabeth Kolbert, Field Notes from a Catastrophe. It's our second year, and by just looking at you, it appears that we have been successful. It's the first part of this, the coming together. We hope that we inspire you in this conversation. We hope that we start something good here together, and that it's just the beginning. And we want to at least do 3 things. If nothing else, we want to at least do 3 things tonight. We want to think about important issues. We want to care about something that we've heard tonight. And at the end of the day, none of this will work if we don't find some way to act and engage. So we want to do those 3 things: to think, to care, and to act. So thank you all for coming here. Let's inspire each other. Let's do good work together. Welcome.
Great, and with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists, beginning with Elizabeth Kolbert, author of this year's UW Common Book, Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate Change. Elizabeth traveled from Alaska to Greenland and visited top scientists to get to the heart of the issue of global warming, bringing the environment into the consciousness of the American people and reporting on what's happening and what we can do about it. Chosen as one of the 100 notable books of the year for 2006 by the New York Times Book Review, Field Notes from a Catastrophe grew out of an award-winning 3-part series in The New Yorker, where she has been a staff writer since 1999. She has written dozens of articles for that magazine, as well as pieces that have been published in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, and Mother Jones, and in anthologies including The Best American Science and Nature Writing and The Best American Political Writing. A collection of her work, The Prophet of Love and Other Tales of Power and Deceit, was published in 2004. She is a graduate of Yale University and lives with her family in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Elizabeth Kolbert.
Thank you.
Our second panelist for the evening is Professor David Battisti, the Tamaki Endowed Chair of Atmospheric Sciences here at the University of Washington. David has been in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences since 1990 and has also served as the director of the Joint Institute for the Study of the Atmosphere and Ocean and is the director of the UW's Earth Initiative. He has been twice awarded the UW Distinguished Teacher Award. David's research focuses on understanding the natural variability of the climate system and on the interactions between the ocean, the atmosphere, the land, and sea ice. He is also working on the impacts of climate variability and climate change on food production in Mexico, Indonesia, and China. He is the author or co-author of more than 70 research papers published in peer-reviewed journals, and his research has contributed to the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which last week was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Please join me in welcoming David Battisti. Our final panelist for tonight is King County Executive Ron Sims. The 14th largest county in the nation, King County includes the city of Seattle and has an overall population of 1.8 million people, about 30% of the state total. This is Ron's third term as county executive. Before that, he was a member of the King County Council. In 1999, in 1988, as a member of the council, he tried to set up a county office to study the effects of climate change and was laughed at by the Seattle Times. They're not laughing anymore, and now that he's county executive, his climate plan, which is aimed at reducing and adapting to the effects of global warming, is lauded as one of the most comprehensive in the nation. In May of 2007, Ron was one of 6 individuals given the Climate Protection Award by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Ron was born in Spokane and graduated from Central Washington University, but we won't hold that against him. Please welcome Ron Sims. So you all will be asking the majority of tonight's questions, but I wanted to start us off by asking you each to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about the experiences that brought you here tonight. When did you start to care about climate change and why? And we'll start with you, Elizabeth.
Well, it was interesting that you mentioned that Ron brought up climate change, first brought up climate change in 1988, which is when I think many people, though not many of the students in this room who weren't actually born at that time, became aware of climate change. Is when there were some of the earliest congressional hearings, and it was a very, very hot summer. And it's also when I became aware of climate change, just as a citizen. And what brought me to this issue was that I learned about climate change. I read some of the early popular books that came out, including The End of Nature, which maybe many of you have read by Bill McKibben. And over the years, like a lot of citizens, I sort of waited for this issue, which many people had portrayed as being so important, to rise to the top of both the news agenda and the political agenda. And like many Americans, I waited and waited and waited, and nothing seemed to be happening. So when I went to the New Yorker myself in 1999, I started to think, well, you know, people are probably pretty perplexed about this issue. Is it really the most important issue facing the world, or isn't it? And it didn't seem to me that even a pretty diligent reader of the daily press could figure that out. So, you know, I guess instead of just, as our mayor of New York liked to say, instead of just looking in the mirror and complaining, I thought, well, I should find a way to write about this. And it actually turned out, I want to say, and I'm not asking for sympathy here, but it actually turned out to be quite hard. It's a very hard story to tell because of the lack of stories. A lot of it is pretty data-driven, as you probably realize by reading the book. So I went looking for stories, and when I finally found the story that opened the book, the story of Shishmaref, this tiny town in Alaska that was disappearing, that was when I first felt that I really had found a way to tell this story. So that's really how I got involved in this issue.
Thank you. David?
I got interested in climate change, actually, maybe 5 years after I was a faculty member here working in climate sciences. At the beginning, climate change didn't really interest me that much. In 1995, 5 years into my professorship here, a report came out and had a famous line that said, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate." This was a statement, I think, that made a lot of us in the community a little bit nervous. Since most of you are freshmen, I'll say a few words about being a scientist. Being a scientist, you're trained to be extremely careful and extremely conservative. And when you hear a statement like that, the other part of the science training that comes in is that you basically try to rip it apart. You try to disprove things that you're given. And if you just keep on attacking these statements and it doesn't fall, then you have a little bit more confidence that probably the statement might be on the mark. And so that statement, I think, got me interested in actually looking very carefully at the data and at the models. At the time, I think many of the people in the community felt a little nervous about the certainty in that statement. And after another 12 years and a lot more work, because a lot of people were trying to rip that statement down, the evidence is actually quite convincing. And both in terms of the observed record of change over the last 100 years, which has been 1.5, roughly about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit global average temperature change and some regional differences. And in terms of the understanding the limitations of the climate models and the uncertainty in what you would expect and the attribution of the changes over the last century to human activities. So in a way that a lot of that work, which is done by a large community of people and is summarized in these reports that come out every 5 or 6 years that are actually issued by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change that Youren mentioned. Those reports have come to a body of evidence. It's actually quite convincing that the observed changes over the 20th century, first of all, what they are, quantifying them, and that they're doing to human activity. And I think it's actually appropriate that that organization, which is a collection of thousands of scientists from all over the world, actually was awarded the prize because it's very much a collective scientific endeavor and not the work of any handful of individuals.
Politicians are used to editorials that either praise us or admonish us. And in 1988, I received a very severe spanking for the proposal that King County as a government needed to look at the issues of climate change. But I want to skip and talk about a surge that occurred. In the early 2000, the University of Washington has a superb school of climate impact, and we contracted with that school as a county and asked them one question: what would our environment be in 2050? And we assumed that all things that we see today would remain pretty static, and we found out that that wasn't going to be the case, that we were going to have substantial species change, we were going to have issues with our winter climate, we wouldn't have enough water for people and for fish, we were going to have to devise a different strategy for the species that we're protecting now that are endangered, that may be replaced or lost because of because of temperature change. We didn't know what was going to replace them. We saw single-cell life changes. We knew that we were going to have newly resident illnesses here. So we took the information that we got from the University of Washington School of Climate Impact, planned backwards to now, and said the decisions we would make now would reflect what we believe the science tells us will be the environment in 2050. It's a 176-page report that has 2 pillars to it. One is you have to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, well beyond what the Kyoto Treaty prescribes. And the other one is adaptation, how we live in a world of climate change. So it's been and we're still learning things every day. We have been looking about whether or not in this area would we see all neighborhoods having the same pattern of warming. And we went to there's a joint study that's taking place. It involves the metropolitan area of Phoenix, whose temperatures increased by 2 degrees since 1995 in the daytime from 110 to 112. And then in the evening by 12 degrees on average. But we found that in the older neighborhoods that were the poorer neighborhoods, they were heat islands. They radiated more heat than neighborhoods that were more affluent. But they also had more heat-related illnesses. And we believe that we'll find the same pattern here as well. So there's a great deal of data in trying to put together a comprehensive plan. But the one thing is, every time you peel something, you find even more to do. But the world that we have now will not be the world of 2050 in this county. The forests are changing. We know that. We've seen that. We're having changes in terms of the species that are living here, whether they are animal, whether they're reptile or amphibian. We've already seen that in salmon species. So we have some incredible challenges on the way. It'll be an exciting time to be living as we try to work through that. But it will be an era of extraordinary change.
Thank you all very much. And now we'll take student questions. So I will direct the questions to one of the panelists, and then the others on the panel can join in as they see fit.
My name is Beth Scholler, and I'm a senior majoring in English and comparative history of ideas. And we noticed throughout field notes of Catastrophe, and even on the cover, it's called climate change. But throughout the media, there's a distinction drawn between global warming and climate change. And could you comment on whether there is a difference between the two of the concepts and what the significance is for the general public?
I think I actually use them interchangeably, to be honest, in that I think they are typically used interchangeably, to be frank. But I think that the theory behind, there's sort of two answers to that. One, you could argue that people, there's a slight political agenda here, and I've been asked about this before, and I certainly didn't have that political agenda, but that global warming is, bad and scary, and climate change as well. The climate, changes, and it's not so bad. But I certainly want to reassure you that I did not use the term for that reason. But I did use, there's also an alternative argument, which is that there was for a while, and I think that this has died down because it's practically impossible to find any part of the world where you can still point to lower temperatures. But you can argue that global warming doesn't cover the range of possibilities of climate change, and that climate change, being a sort of somewhat vaguer and broader term, just covers all of the many possibilities of changes in precipitation. The possibility that some parts of the world would get colder, that's not inconsistent with global warming, but people often claim that it is. So I personally used the term sort of interchangeably, and there's just one other term that I'd want to add, which is that a couple of years ago, there was this push by the administration to change the whole thing again, because climate change is now too scary. We're going to call it climate variability. And I'm happy to say that that doesn't seem to have caught on. But there genuinely there are government documents that you can find that are pushing this concept that we shouldn't even call it climate change.
If you look at the media reports taken as a body as a whole, and if you had to give them a grade, what grade would you assign to media reports on, for instance, the latest IPCC report that came out earlier this year? Is there anything significant that's missing? Maybe Elizabeth, David, and then Ron.
Well, if I were just grading them on the reports that came out on the latest IPCC reports, and I'd be very interested to hear David's response to this, I think I'd give a pretty good grade. Those were pretty straight-on stories. They got a lot of press. They were the lead of, I think they were the lead in the New York Times, and they got a lot of press that, basically coherently covered it. If I were giving the media a grade over the last decade or so, it would be a pretty poor grade. It might even be a failing grade. So those are sort of two different grades. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons I personally just got involved was not out of any great knowledge about the topic, but just simply that sense that you couldn't get a coherent story, just as a reader. So I was a reader sort of just like everybody else.
Yeah, I think the grades for the early years up till really recently would be really low. And some of that is, I think, a cultural problem between the media and science community. The media very much wants to see two sides of every story, so they report it as if it's a democracy, but science is not a democracy. And you can always find somebody who will disagree, but if 99 out of 100 scientists at mainstream places in the world all have the same opinion, and you find somebody who's not a climate scientist in someplace else, you get two opinions, and that's kind of the traditional way of work, which isn't a fair way of representing the science. So that's been a problem on the journalism side. More recently, I'd say it's much better. There's a tendency to try to shove every change under the rug of climate change right now, which is a little bit hard to prove, a lot of the statements that are being made. But as a whole, it's actually quite good. I guess I fault our community a little bit of being so focused, even though I said that it was very important for us to sort out the last 150 years. That's very much a problem, I think, that's important for the science community because it gives us some idea of how good the data are. It gives us some idea of how good the models are, where they're weak. So that's been a really important process. But what that's done is it's created, because the changes actually over the last 100 years, believe it or not, are very small compared to what's going to happen. I think that's the most important message that our community should be giving to the media, and for some reason that's not. What's happened is that there's a debate whether or not the change over the last 100 years in this particular place is due to global warming. That's actually not the message that my community should be giving to the media. The message is that over the next 100 years, the projected changes, just in terms of global average temperature, that's the way I look at it, are going to be 4 times that of the past 100 years. That the rate of change is at least 100 times faster than nature can do this by itself. And you have to go back to at least the last ice age to find differences in climate that are going to be as big as the difference between today and 100 years from now. That's something that, believe it or not, is a consensus in my community, and is one of the reasons why, as a community, back in 1995, a lot of us weren't that interested in it, because the changes in carbon dioxide over the last 100 years don't have that big of an effect compared to the changes that are going to happen over the next 100 years. And those changes are big enough that we've known since like the late 1800s what would happen if you did this. So in a sense, it's not a new problem.
I think the internet has provided the capacity to see some excellent reporting. I don't think it's uniform. I think the media is just learning to cover it. You know, you go to The Guardian on the internet and you see a fairly comprehensive section on climate change. There's some things, though, that are more difficult to report, and I'll give you an example. In this county, and if you look at United States, Canada, China, the European countries, India, you see a preoccupation with how to sustain economic growth. And even in an age of global warming, that's what adaptation's about. But if you go into we call the Southern Hemisphere, Africa, which will be incredibly hard hit, Australia, which will be the worst hit, and Latin America, Indonesia, the Philippines, where we're busily telling them that we need to protect tropical forests. Well, what they look and call that is the new imperialism, because they're saying forests are not going to generate the capacity that they need to have a high quality of life on the continent. And so that doesn't get reported. It's a huge, huge geopolitical fight that's already on the way. Which countries are going to have coastal lines, or which countries are going to disappear because of sea rise? And then the additional loss of fresh water. And when we think we're in an oil fight now, we're going to be in a huge fight by 2050, where we're going to have wars over who controls dams and reservoirs and supplies of fresh water. And that doesn't get reported very well. Maybe in some science journals, some political journals, but it hasn't been something that is widely reported in the media. And it's interesting because it's going to define everybody in this room. It really is. It's going to have a substantial consequence for everybody in this room. The population of the world will outstrip its fresh water. You're not going to be able to talk about desalination as an augmented supply. We're simply going to have new fights, and they're going to be more, that those wars that will take place will be far more volatile than the existing climate we have now, which is simply, in many cases, fights over fuel supply.
Hi, my name is Alberto. I'm a sophomore in the electrical engineering department. And so I take public transportation. I have a fuel-efficient car. I use an Nalgene bottle, and I've converted to fluorescent bulbs. If you were to prioritize a list of solutions that would really make a difference, where should we start, and what does that mean to the average person?
Yeah, I get this one a lot, and I guess, you know, in your own behavior, it certainly doesn't hurt to save. It saves you money. It reduces the amount of resources you use, and it saves you money. In the global scheme of emissions, it's not the solution. If everybody conserved to the hilt, it still wouldn't be a full solution. But it does do other things than just actually reduce carbon dioxide. it signifies your behavior actually sends a message. The behavior and the things you buy, consumer choices, the behavior, in my case, around my kids, what I do and how I live my life, the behavior of how you guys live your life, and the expectations you have on people like Ron. And the important thing here is that the amount of emissions are such that the only way to really solve this problem is by an international collaboration at both the government level and in the corporations. And that, to kind of understand that requires some education about just how severe the problem is, and knowing just what you can do if you switch to, say, to nuclear, or to switch to, just trying to conserve. And so the education part of it is really important. So you know what you're talking about, and when you run into somebody who's throwing a specious argument against you, you can actually counter that. But voting for people who have a long-term outlook and an agenda that actually is taking into account the long term is really critical. Recognizing that this is an international problem, and having an administration like the present one that's actually looking inward is the wrong approach. The U.S. has to be one of the leaders on this. It can't happen without the developing nations being a big part of this. But there has to be incentives, and the incentives have to come from governments and from corporations.
Those decisions you're making will hopefully influence some very significant alteration of our manufacturing processes, our consumer products. And it'll also send a signal, I think, to political leaders and business leaders as to the fact that there is widespread support for moving aggressively in another direction so that we will reduce the severity of global warming. We're going to have it. The issue will be its severity. So those are really great decisions that you're making. I don't think that, we always try to say, we should never feel overwhelmed by an individual action. It is an individual action that simply multiplies itself among friends and families and communities that will have a ripple effect. And then we'll have a political effect, because in this country and in most democracies and in most places where you've seen change, it always starts at the individual level, it migrates into a larger group, then kind of a national momentum. It is very true that we're going to have to change who gets elected, and whether they actually understand and can speak fluently to the issues of what is affecting our climate, what impacts are going to be there, and what we must do in order to not only adapt in this culture, but how do you reduce the impacts in other cultures, and how do you change economies in other cultures, and how do you protect new species? There's a great deal to be done. The fact that people are buying Priuses is not lost on us. When the 1 millionth Prius was sold, trust me, it was not lost on anybody who's elected. It was like, there must be something happening out there, which was really a wonderful sign. Even this administration, which is, I'm partisan, but whether you're partisan or not, this administration is in denial. But it was really interesting, the movement they made off the Prius sales. All of a sudden they were saying, well, maybe there might be things happening out there, and maybe we should engage. Some of the departments were far more aggressive, but it was nice seeing that happen, because the political process has clearly shifted, which is why I think you see the next presidential candidates, all of them are going to say, we have to step up and do something that's going to be extraordinary. So congratulations, I'm glad that you're making all those decisions.
I'll just say very briefly that I assume it's the first presidential election that many of you will be voting in, and without being melodramatic about it, to say that the future of the world, depends on it is probably not too much of an exaggeration. Whoever the next president is going to be dealing with a successor to the Kyoto Accord, whether the U.S. will enter into some kind of international agreement. And we need a president who, as both David and Ron said, really steps up to the plate and takes the lead. And just to address the other part of it, individual action, this is a question that always comes up when people care, and it's really an incredibly profound issue. How much does what I do make a difference? And anyone who has looked at this issue seriously, and Youren is one of them, would say, obviously we need to change the incentives in the economy. That's the only way we're going to solve this problem. And until now, or really even still now, anything that smacks of raising costs on certain forms of energy, which would obviously make it more attractive to have other forms of energy, faces really a political uphill slog. And I think that's unfortunately still true. And I guess it's a pretty big burden on first-time voters to say, that's got to change. We cannot be a country where we don't accept that solving this problem is going to require higher energy costs for fossil fuels. Most countries pay much higher costs for fossil fuels, and they use a lot less energy as a result. I don't think that anyone has come up with a way to solve this through voluntary action. It's going to take really economy-wide changes. And the American voting public is going to have to be willing to support those changes. And until those things happen, I don't really see much hope for solving this problem, I have to say.
Just as a thought-provoking exercise, David, since you brought up nuclear power, there's been debates in the environmental community, in the science community, the engineering community, in the world about nuclear power and whether or not it has a renaissance or should have a renaissance. So I just want you all to, just to yourselves, think about whether you'd give a thumbs up, a thumbs down, sort of where you are with nuclear power. So go ahead and just look to your neighbor and then think about how you would kind of vote on it. And then I'm just going to ask the panel to do the same thing. So thumbs up, thumbs down, nuclear power. No words.
Am I supposed to do?
No words.
See, I'm a scientist.
I'm
I'm going to
agnostic
be cautious
myself.
on this one.
I think it's a really, really hard
I'm a
question.
politician. We're decisive.
So, no, I think that actually, no, I don't want to share my opinion on that one. But I do want to make the point that these are the kind of things that are going to be coming down the road. You've already been sold biofuels, ethanol. Now, here's a mistake that's not very hard to figure out, and to figure out why actually this is happening. It has nothing to do with solving the CO2 problem, right? So these are the kind of things that you guys are going to have to vote on. You better understand it, right? And I think that's the point. I think rather than say, how do you feel about nuclear right now, is like learn about the advantages and disadvantages. Learn about the advantages and disadvantages of ethanol and biofuels in general and the true cost of these things, right?
Right. The only thing that I would say about nuclear is I totally agree with David. We're going to have to face these questions. It's a huge question when people talk about scaling up energy to replace, if we are truly serious about replacing fossil fuels. Nuclear is one of the few things that people come up with that's scalable. I agree that, with many of the people in this audience who did the big thumbs down, that there are huge unanswered questions around nuclear power that are very, very frightening, especially in the kind of world we live in today. But I think that one point to be made politically about nuclear power is that people often make is there a cost factor? We're already proposing big subsidies for nuclear power right now, and that's a question that's a voting issue too that people should be aware of. Can nuclear really compete on a cost basis? And we haven't actually seen that happen yet because we've always offered pretty big subsidies, in fact, pretty big insurance subsidies to the nuclear industry up till now.
My name is Brian Smoliak. I'm a second-year grad student in atmospheric science, and I also write science for the Daily here. Here's my question. In his latest book, Cool It, the author, economist, and self-described skeptical environmentalist Bjorn Lomborg writes that society needs to allay its sense of imminent catastrophe and revise many of the, quote, elaborate and expensive plans currently being considered to stop global warming. He argues that we should deal with things like HIV, AIDS, malnutrition, these sort of concerns first. And so this kind of begets the idea that the time to making large cuts in emissions isn't really at hand. So what's your response?
Well, you can always find something else to do, except for the fact that global warming will be you talk about significant acts, will be far more significant in impact on the world's population than the things that he's identifying. So you can't push it aside. There's a lot of us are working on the issues of HIV, AIDS, and hunger in the world. And there's just, I can give you a multitude. But the overarching thing that will define our capacity and our ability will be how we approach the issue of global warming. And if you shove it off to the side, it will continue to insert itself. Talk about the African continent, for example. You know, here's a continent that has a number of resident illnesses. Here's a continent with an incredible number of people who will succumb to HIV/AIDS and malaria. But I can also tell you that the data that is coming now out of research says that they will have a greater loss of life attributable to the impacts of global warming than they've had for anything that we now know exists in Africa. So I would tell that economist that that's a very narrow view. Let's do all these other things first. When Africa, in fact, has to have see the rest of the world, for instance, reduce its emissions, and at the same time see investments in the country that will both be an offset to emissions that are in the industrial world, and at the same time allow their economy to grow, and at the same time see some sort of systems and structures of treatment for what we now see as a proliferation of new illnesses and viruses that are going to exist there.
The question of, would someone who's now dying on the street in a small village be better off if you took, the money you would be spending on a gas tax and gave it to them? Today, that might be true, but you're talking about the wrong timescale here, and if anybody should be pissed off about that, it's you guys in the audience, because it is, the future that you will inherit, and it's the generations that, to be honest, aren't even born yet. And that gets to the question of, what do we owe to the future? If we simply always talk about the present day, then it's right, it's not worth it. It's not worth doing anything. We're all sitting in this room, we're all pretty well fed tonight, everything's fine. What obligations do we have to a future that we can unfortunately already predict? We have very good predictive capacities. So if you don't, you have to not look only at next week. And so I think that analysis is terribly misleading to say, what would we be better off doing today? Today we might be better off doing nothing, but 20 years from now, when many of you, are as old as I am, we won't have been better off.
The one thing I would add to that is the certainty of what's going to happen if you put greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is really quite established. And the problem is that the source of greenhouse gases primarily is burning fossil fuels. So when you're saying you want to change a process and get to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, you're talking about changing the whole energy source for the world. And that's a very difficult process. And the longer you wait, the longer it's going to take to do that. And carbon dioxide just accumulates in the atmosphere. Some of it's going into the ocean. That's also a problem. The ocean is getting more acidic. Right? But a lot of it stays in the atmosphere. And we have really quite good understanding of how much of it will stay in the atmosphere. And so that the emissions have to come down rapidly and quickly. And given that this is the world's energy source that we're actually talking about, this is a very big problem that has to start now.
I'm James, a student in education. And first off, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here tonight. Now, it's clear that many people realize that global warming is an issue that requires immediate attention and action. And from reading the book and from hearing similar arguments, there seems to be a point of no return. That is, once global warming gets so bad, there is nothing we'll be able to do to stop it. So my question is, if we reach that point, and it does seem like we are on that path, what will our options be? Should we accept the fact that there's nothing that we can do, or should we continue to look for ways to address the issue?
I hope I didn't suggest that there is a point of no return. But there's a point at which you set in motion processes that unfortunately do become impossible to stop. And an example that's often used is probably melting the Greenland ice sheet, which would probably put most of Seattle underwater eventually. And once you start that process, to use a sort of bad metaphor, it snowballs, and it's virtually impossible to stop for for reasons that we won't go into tonight, but you start to lose elevation, you start to get rain on top of the ice sheet, so you set these changes in motion. And then the question comes up, well, okay, when have we set those changes in motion? And I think, and I'm going to defer to David on this, but I think the really honest answer is we don't know exactly when we set those changes in motion, but we're getting awfully close. We're getting frighteningly close to that point. And that is why people are urging such dramatic action. They're urging dramatic action to avoid going over this threshold, which we don't know exactly what it is, so we ought to err on the side of caution. Don't you think if you were crossing a threshold into catastrophe, you'd kind of want to keep as far back as possible? So that's what we're talking about. Now, we will not know we've crossed that threshold until many, many years later. We will not know definitively. But there's always something to be done. I mean, we are determining now the final result of this process. We are determining the Earth's temperature. That's what we're in the process of doing. And the more greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere, the higher that ultimate temperature is going to go. It's as simple as that. And along the way, various dire things will start to kick in. So what we really do have to be worried about right now, today, is crossing over these thresholds whereby, not that you have runaway global warming, but that you set in motion processes that have very catastrophic consequences.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm a freshman. When you talk to people completely disinterested in the protection of the environment, and not only the protection of the environment, but disinterested in their own future and the future of everyone else on the planet, what do you say to them to inspire them to care and to empower them?
I try not to talk to people like that. No, I think that question illustrates how indifferent to the planet you have to be, or to yourself, as you point out, or to the children that you may one day decide to have, not to care about this issue. You really have to be in just a complete vacuum, I suppose, maybe in your BMW with the windows rolled up and the air conditioning turned on. I really don't know, how you can reach someone who just doesn't give a damn. But I think anyone who slightly gives a damn, anyone who's thinking of, living to a nice, ripe old age, anyone who's thinking of having a family of their own one day, could be reached on this issue, because there's nothing sort of more fundamental than, do you want your family to have a planet to live on? It's really sort of as simple as that. We human beings have evolved and flourished. Civilization is very, very tiny fraction of time that life and that even human beings have lived on this planet in a very, very selective climate. And we are now moving out of that climate. And we don't know where this is going to end. But if you're attached at all, to life as we know it, life as human beings have known it, then you ought to be concerned about this issue. I guess that's what I would tell that person.
Yeah, I would say even on a local level, there's a lot of uncertainty in how this will play out for individuals, and it's a place that we've never been before, to be honest. And so depending on your, how much of a risk taker you are, you might want to just ignore that fact and just go full speed ahead. Things will be different, extremely different, and it will have impacts locally. I think that, like, for example, the group that Ron was talking about at the UW here have played out in this scenario for if you want to live in Seattle, is actually, even just 50 years from now, is extremely taxing. Population increase is only one of many problems, and climate change actually rivals population increase, I think, in terms of a problem 50 years from now or 40 years from now. That's in all of our lifetimes. Even me, I'll be still here, I think, by then. But I think the more important thing for me, and I always felt that, climate change science in 1880-something or other, the first guy calculated what would happen if you doubled carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the answer is the same pretty much today as it was in 1886. That's over 120 years ago, right? That's a really different world. There's going to be a lot of people who are disrupted, and eventually that will affect us. The sort of environmental refugees you're going to have are going to be remarkable compared to anything we've seen. The ability to grow staple crops, for example, in India, is going to go down. I mean, we know that much already. How much it will go down and what will have to be replaced by in a place where the population is increasing remarkably fast, that's quite a scary situation if you're interested in stability of your life, right, or your government.
You know, when I was in college, I had a big furrow. I could actually grow hair in those days. And had a dashiki and a striped fist and really narrow sunglasses. And felt at that time that the university environment was the most incredible opportunity to learn to make change. And when I look back over the years from my college days to where I am now, I actually have seen extraordinary change. So when you look at the issues of global warming, it's very clear that we're going to be living in a period of global warming. That's going to occur. The issue will be its severity, but not if we're going to be in that world. But I can't think of a single discipline in the universities today that cannot be applied to make change. Not a one. And if sometimes I said, God, if I could just do it again, but I made so many stupid mistakes that I'm glad I don't have to relive all those periods. But if I were doing it again, I would relish the absolute opportunity to make change. Political change, technological change, educational change. It's just, to me, going to be explosively wonderful because it's going to require more talent and more skill and more intellect than has been applied to anything up to now. This has got to be a great, God, being in a university again has just got to be like eating the best meal ever because everything you face is going to be more taxing, more demanding than what your parents experienced. So I guess in answer to your question, I would be, one, very optimistic. I would feel very empowered, and I would spend my time in a university acquiring the skills and the ability to be a change agent. My father, who I always brag about because he got one bad grade from first grade through his master's. He got an A- in third grade. I did not follow my father's footsteps. He took me to a place called Lake Coeur d'Alene, which is in Idaho, and my father was always teaching me lessons, so he said, Bud, look at all that sand. And my father was an immense man intellectually and physically, so I did what he told me. And he said, Bud, look at the water, look at the shoreline. And I looked at the water and shoreline, not knowing what he was going to say, and he says, Bud, you can go through life and never make a wave. You can go through life and make a wave that gently caresses the shore, or you can go through life and make a wave that rearranges the shoreline. But I would tell you that that's the choice you have to make. You can go through life and be nothing, or you can go through life and be extraordinary. But I can also tell you that if you look at extraordinary change that's going to be required of us, and the extraordinary change of people who are doing the work now, the difference is you have smart, university-educated people taking that leadership, whether they be scientists or people can become CEOs. So I would tell you, wow, if you're a freshman, wow, this is going to be a great period of time of great challenge. You're going to have to see wonderful things. Wow, it's going to be exciting. It will not be dull any day. And you're going to rock and roll. I think this is a great time to be young again and a student again and in universities again.
Let's actually close by getting our other two panelists' thought on that same thing. If you think about the next 4 or 5 years, which covers the time that most of the first-year students in the audience here will be at the university, thinking about what you want the world to look like 4 or 5 years from now, how they can help make it happen, what advice do you have for them, what challenges do you want to present them with inside the classroom, outside the classroom, in their personal lives, in 2 or 3 minutes? We'll start with David.
University of Washington, in my opinion, I've been here since '79 as a graduate student, and then as a faculty member. I think it's the best university in the world. The teaching, I believe, at this university is as good as it is because it's a phenomenal research university. It's the best research university in the world in a lot of areas, including environmental sciences, which I'm involved in. The opportunities here, because it's such a great research university, the opportunities as a student are twofold. The classrooms tend to be really exciting because usually the people who are actually on the cutting edge are in your classroom. They are the cutting edge, and they're telling you the stories of what's going on. The other thing which is true is there's so much research going on here that there's lots of opportunities to get involved in creating new knowledge. And I can't tell you how important that is for actually deeply learning something, to actually be involved creating the knowledge yourself. And it will also instill in you a sense of passion for being the best you can and making a difference that will be with you for the rest of your life. And those opportunities are here all over the place because there is so much research going on. And believe it or not, almost all the faculty members are really excited about having the students as part of their research team. So the opportunities are there, and I would say take advantage of it because they'll probably be the best experiences and the best memories of your life that will make a lasting difference.
Elizabeth, last words.
Sure. Well, journalists aren't usually called on to give advice for pretty obvious reasons, but I guess my advice would be don't wait for other people to solve this problem. They haven't so far, and I think that the energy here has really got to come from young people who will be inheriting the mess that basically our generation up here has bequeathed to you. And I hope that people will be angry, to be honest. If I were you, I'd get kind of pissed off. And I would start to really confront. We can start, right here at the university. I'm sure there's a lot that could be going on right here at the university that would make a big difference. And that you all could participate in, but also that the administration needs to take action on. Someone came to a talk I gave this afternoon and talked about how it was always overheated in a certain classroom building. Well, that just shouldn't be happening, and you guys should be the force to make sure that it doesn't happen anymore, and then you can take that back to your own houses and your own communities. So I guess that would just be my only point. Don't wait around. Don't think someone else is going to solve this, because so far they haven't.
So get inspired, get pissed off, go out into the concourse and check out the resource fair. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Let's have another round of applause for our panelists, please. Have a good night.